What is the core message of your presentation?
The core message of my presentation is that the American system of religious freedom is grounded in the notion that religion is valuable. It's valuable to politics, it's valuable to the common good, it's valuable to democracy. So we have religious freedom not just as some arbitrary right that's given to people who happen to be religious. We have religious freedom because religion is necessary for the health of American democracy. I think that's been lost. I don't think it's an odd way to put it in Canada. So I brought that to this conference in order to make the point, but also to say that that idea, while it's been dominant in America for a long time, is very much under challenge. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of that problem.
Freedom of religion is a fundamental freedom as defined in both the Canadian Charter and the U.S. Constitution. Does it remain so today in practice?
No, in neither place, depending, of course, on how you define religious freedom. If it means the right to go into your house of worship and do whatever you do there and never bring it outside the house of worship, namely freedom of worship, if that's all it means, then yeah, those things are protected. For the most part, most religious people in Canada and the United States can do whatever they want inside their house of worship. But historically in America, it has meant the right to bring your religion into public life, into business life, into civil society, and even into politics. That's what is under challenge in both countries, I think. So yes, freedom of religion is in crisis, I would argue, in most Western democracies, most recently in the United States, and the stakes are very high. We need to protect it.
If freedom of religion is a fundamental freedom, can it also be argued to be a foundational freedom?
Well, of course it's foundational. In America, we have traditionally, although less and less recently, called it the first freedom. There are two reasons for that. One is it's the first of all the Bill of Rights. It's the first 16 words of the First Amendment of our Bill of Rights. But it's foundational in a much deeper sense than just being first sequentially. It grounds itself in what a human being is. Every human being has a conscience. And the conscience is the way we try to discover what the truth is about religion. What is to be done, what is to be avoided, what is good, what is evil. That's what the conscience is. That is foundational to all human rights. I would argue it's foundational to democracy, to self-governance. If you don't have this right, then none of the other rights of freedom of speech, assembly, redress of grievance, other rights really lack grounding. They aren't rooted deeply in the soil. If our rights are just created by government, well, government can take them away. So I think there's a great deal of wisdom in thinking that governments are designed to protect rights that exist prior to government. How do you determine what those are? Well, the first of those is this religious right. So there can be other rights created by government, but they aren't foundational, they aren't fundamental like this right of religious freedom. It's not the only one, there are others, but I think this one is prior to all the others. And this is, I think, it sounds like it may be sort of a supremacy argument about religion and religious people. It really isn't. You notice I talked about the conscience of every human being. Now this is a Christian understanding because I believe every human being is created in the image of likeness of God and therefore has a conscience. So as a Christian, I have to respect the consciences of non-Christians and non-believers. The reverse is not necessarily true. If the state creates a right to conscience and a right to religion, as I said, the state can take it away. So it's how you root it. That's why religious freedom is foundational.
Freedom of religion, like other freedoms, is understood to be born and exercised first and foremost by individuals. But what about the role of faith communities or faith-based institutions? Do they exercise these freedoms as communities of faithful individuals?
Yes, well, the answer to that is yes, religious communities have the same rights, or ought to, as religious individuals. Most religious individuals do not practice their religion by themselves. They may pray, they do pray by themselves, but they also pray together. but they tend to gather with others of like mind and spirit and carry out their religious rites, rites, but then they move into the public life of their country. In the American system, when our founders, who were mainly Protestants at the time, back in the late 18th century, took a look at what they wanted to protect in the First Amendment, they had two categories. One was rights of conscience, which is something that any Protestant Christian will immediately understand what that means. The other was free exercise of religion. And these Protestant founders chose the latter. They did not choose to protect rights of conscience. They chose to protect free exercise of religion. Why? In part because they wanted to protect religious communities. Conscience is an individual thing, but religion in public life, which is what they really wanted to protect, involves communities of religious action, conduct, as well as belief. They did that because they believed that all religions, not just Christianity, should be encouraged to contribute to our understandings of what the common good is, how that should be reflected in our laws and public policies. In short, they wanted a virtuous citizenry, and while they understood that virtue comes from things other than religion, it also comes from religion. So they wanted to include it in our public life, and that's why we have the First Amendment. So yes, religious communities are very important. One other thing about religious communities, they limit the power of government. Now, if you believe the state is the guarantor of all rights, that minorities can only be protected by the state, which tends to be more of a French understanding of religious freedom than certainly an American one, then this perhaps is not as compelling an argument. But if you believe, as the American founders did, that the threat to freedom and equality is concentrations of political power, namely the state, then you want to limit that. And that's why we have, in the American tradition, checks and balances, state power, national power, and why we have religious freedom, freedom of religious conduct, freedom of religious exercise. Religious communities, and here's the point, restrict the power of government simply by virtue of their existence. Religious communities typically are made up of people who adhere to a greater power than the state. That's a limit on government right there. Call it a theological limit. But also, they tend to do things that in their absence, government would do. Faith-based universities, faith-based secondary schools, faith-based soup kitchens, immigration and naturalization services, homes for the aged and the poor. Often, non-religious people do this too, but religious motives for doing these things tend to be more lasting because people believe this is a matter of what God is calling them to do. So religious communities do have religious freedom, and it's very important that that be protected.
How do we ensure, and why must we ensure, the robust exercise of religious freedom within a multi-faith and multicultural society?
I think because societies don't work well without religious freedom. It is precisely because societies are multicultural and multi-faith that religious freedom has to be protected. It means equality of all religious communities. It prevents majoritarian tyranny, whether it be theocratic or religious in nature or aggressive secularism in nature. It protects the right of all religious communities and non-believers to enter into the public life of a nation on the basis of equality. But think of it this way. If there were such a thing as an atheist or a purely secular or non-religious understanding of religious freedom, it would clearly provide protections for the atheists and the non-believers and the secularists, but it probably would not protect the rights of the religious communities. The reverse is not true. The proper understanding of religious freedom is not that religious people are superior, but they have a voice. They must not be cut out of the public life of any democracy. So yes, religious freedom is the answer to the problem, if it is, presented by multiculturalism in a multi-faith society. It is not the problem itself. It's the answer to the problem.